A woman waiting by the wrong door, mistake or trap. Welcome to Rust Evidence. I am your host, Silas Wren. Share in the mystery. Comment where you're listening from. Your voices bring these stories alive. Let's begin. The evening had settled into one of those slow Paris dusks when the street lamps come on timidly, their light blurred by a thin drizzle. Maigret sat by the window of his office, the collar of his overcoat unbuttoned, a pipe cooling between his fingers. He was not working, not exactly. He had finished with the day's reports an hour ago and had told Janvier and the others they could leave early. Yet he lingered, staring out at the street where the rain made pools on the cobblestones. It wasn't that he expected a call. It was more the opposite. He enjoyed the silence, the weight of it pressing against the glass, the city going about its business as if he were a man forgotten in a corner. On the desk before him was a note from Madame Maigret. "Dinner is at 8. Don't dawdle." He smiled faintly. She knew him too well. His tendency to wander, to pause at a cafe for a glass of beer, or to sit too long at the Quai des Orfèvres with his thoughts. Her handwriting carried a kind of patient reproach, softened by affection. He told himself he would be home on time tonight. He tamped the ashes from his pipe and rose, pulling on his hat. The rain had deepened into a fine mist that clung to his cheeks as he stepped out. He walked slowly toward the river, hands in his coat pockets, the Seine's black water sliding by, and the bridges lit like old chandeliers strung with weary bulbs. Paris, at such an hour, was familiar, almost tender, but in the mist, Maigret often felt he was walking through the thoughts of others. Small secrets, lies carried home in silence. At the corner of Rue de Lille, he noticed a figure beneath the awning of a shuttered shop. A woman. She was standing very still, her handbag held tightly under her arm, her head turned every so often toward a door that had not opened. The door belonged to a modest pension, the kind where clerks and seamstresses rented narrow rooms with iron beds. She wasn't dressed for waiting. Her coat was thin, her shoes damp at the tips, and the scarf at her throat too light for the night's chill. What struck Maigret was her composure. Not impatience, not nervous pacing, but a steady waiting, as if her life had narrowed to that single door. He slowed, watching her from across the street as if by accident. She wasn't young, perhaps 40, with dark hair pinned too tightly, giving her face a sternness at odds with her posture. Her eyes darted each time footsteps echoed on the pavement, but always settled back on the same door. And then, something almost imperceptible. Her body stiffened when the concierge came out briefly to empty a pail of water. She stepped back as though ashamed of being caught in her vigil before resuming her place once the concierge retreated. It was nothing. A woman waiting for someone. Paris was full of them, wives, mistresses, tenants with grievances. But Maigret's instinct, that quiet stirring that had so often led him into cases not his own, told him there was something displaced about her. She was waiting beside the wrong door, not because she had mistaken the address, but because she knew it and still chose to wait there. A bus rumbled past, splashing water. The woman flinched, then pulled her scarf tighter. Maigret crossed the street under the pretense of lighting his pipe in the lee of the doorway. Up close, he caught the faintest trace of cheap perfume hastily applied. Her gaze flickered toward him and away, like a person avoiding recognition. He considered speaking, but decided against it. His presence, silent and heavy, was often more useful than a question. He walked on, slowly, turning once to glance back. She was still there, her figure half absorbed by the shadows of the awning. He told himself it was none of his business. He had a wife waiting with dinner at 8. And yet, as he moved toward the Boulevard Saint-Germain, he carried with him the image of that woman, waiting beside the wrong door in the rain. It was a small detail, barely worth remembering, but Maigret knew himself well enough. Such details had a way of returning, like footsteps following him through the city. until one day they knocked at his office door in the form of a crime. The next morning began, as so many did, with a pale light falling through the windows of the Quai des Orfèvres and the smell of damp coats in the corridor outside Maigret's office. He was already at his desk when Janvier came in with the night reports, dropping them with a kind of weary satisfaction that only comes after hours of scanning the routine drudgery of thefts, drunken quarrels, and small frauds. Maigret skimmed the pages, his pipe unlit but gripped between his teeth, his eyes pausing not at the words but at what lay between them. He was not in a hurry, nor did he expect to find anything urgent. Most days began like this, with monotony, until something slight, a phrase, a call, a half-line in the margin, shifted the air. That shift arrived not in the papers, but in the phone ringing with its brusque insistence. Janvier answered, then passed the receiver across with a shrug. Local precinct at Rue de Lille. They'd like you to know a body was found early this morning. Nothing remarkable, they said, but since it's close by. Maigret lifted the receiver, listening in silence, his face giving away nothing. The report was perfunctory. A woman found collapsed near the entrance of a small pension, dead by the time the ambulance arrived. No signs of struggle. She was not a tenant there, according to the concierge, but had been seen waiting outside late into the evening. The words folded neatly over the memory that had haunted Maigret since the night before. The figure under the awning, the thin coat, the eyes that waited too intently on a door that would not open. By the time he hung up, his decision was made. He said nothing to Janvier, only reached for his coat and hat, moving with the slow, deliberate motions that suggested habit rather than urgency. But inwardly, he felt the tightening thread that always accompanied such cases where something trivial, a waiting woman in the rain, became the center of gravity. The rain had ceased, though the pavement was still slick, the air smelling faintly of last night's drizzle mixed with coal smoke from the chimneys. The pension on Rue de Lille stood modestly between a bakery and a tobacconist, its doorway narrow, paint peeling in strips, the name on the plaque almost illegible. A police car stood at the curb, two constables speaking in low voices with the concierge, a stout woman in a wool shawl whose irritation barely masked her unease. Maigret did not stride in with authority. He paused first at the curb, lighting his pipe, letting the scene settle around him. He watched how the neighbors lingered discreetly by their shutters, how a boy delivering bread slowed his bicycle to see what might be happening. Life continued with its ordinary rhythm, though bent slightly out of shape by the presence of death. Only then did he step forward, nodding to the constables with a quiet, "Good morning," before asking the concierge if he might see the body. It had been taken inside, into the modest hall of the pension. She lay on a hastily arranged blanket, her shoes damp, her coat clinging where the fabric had been soaked. Maigret looked at her without haste, taking in the face he had glimpsed beneath the awning. Pale now, lips parted slightly, the tight hairstyle loosened at the temples. She had not been young, nor old, 40 perhaps, but the weariness of years seemed carved into the lines about her mouth. There was no visible wound, no trace of violence. To another, she might have seemed a woman struck down by sudden illness. But Maigret, crouching to observe the set of her features, felt the weight of unspoken things pressing against the silence of the hall. "Do you know her?" he asked the concierge quietly. The woman shook her head, arms folded across her chest as if to ward off intrusion. "Never seen her before last night. She stood there for hours. I told her she couldn't loiter, but she just smiled a little and said she was waiting for someone. I didn't press. What was I to do?" Maigret nodded, his gaze lingering on the small details. The cheap perfume that still clung faintly, the handbag clasped tightly even in death. He motioned for a constable to open it. Inside, the contents were meager: a handkerchief, a small purse with a few francs, and a folded letter. The letter was creased from being read and refolded many times, the ink smudged by damp. He opened it carefully, scanning the lines. It was brief, unsigned, written in a hurried hand. "Meet me at the Rue de l'Île Pension at 9 o'clock. Do not come earlier. Do not speak to anyone. We will resolve everything then. 9 o'clock. He glanced at his watch. The body had been discovered around dawn. She must have been waiting since the previous evening. He recalled the time he had seen her, close to 8, perhaps a quarter past. She had been early then and faithful to the instructions, waiting silently as the letter demanded, faithful until death claimed her. The coroner arrived, a brisk man with spectacles that fogged in the damp hallway. He examined the body, murmured something about possible heart failure, exhaustion, exposure. Nothing conclusive. She wasn't young, he added with a shrug. And if she had a weak heart, standing in the cold rain could have done it. He seemed eager to categorize the matter as routine, to move on. But Maigret's silence made him uncomfortable, and soon he gathered his instruments and left with a promise of a full report. The pension tenants were gathered in whispers on the stairs, craning their necks to catch glimpses. Maigret let them wait. He preferred first to look at the door she had stood beside, the one she had fixed on with such intensity. It belonged to a room on the ground floor, rented by a Monsieur René Besson, according to the concierge. "A quiet man, works at an insurance office," she supplied when pressed. "Keeps to himself, comes and goes at odd hours, but never causes trouble." She hesitated, then added, "He wasn't home last night." "Not until late. I heard his step only after midnight." Maigret listened without comment, though the words settled in his mind with a particular gravity. He walked to the door of Monsieur Besson's room, noting how the wood was scuffed near the lock, how the handle bore the dull shine of frequent use. He knocked gently, though he knew the room was empty. Inside, the air carried the faint, stale smell of a man living alone. Tobacco smoke, unwashed cups, trousers slung over a chair. Nothing extraordinary. And yet, the letter in the woman's bag and her vigil suggested this door held the key to her final hours. He did not linger. There was no need to ransack the place. He had learned long ago that rooms revealed themselves slowly, over repeated visits, much as people did. Instead, he stepped back into the hall, where the tenants had grown restless with their waiting. One by one, he asked them simple questions. Had they seen the woman before? Had they noticed anything unusual? The answers were vague, colored by curiosity more than knowledge. One old clerk said he had glimpsed her from his window, but assumed she was visiting someone. A seamstress on the second floor said she heard voices around 9, though she could not say from where. Contradictions, hesitations, little evasions. Nothing solid, yet each detail added a layer. By midday, the body had been taken away, the hall cleared, life at the pension resuming its routine, though muted. Maigret remained standing, in the doorway for some minutes longer, his pipe smoke curling into the damp air, his eyes half closed as if he were simply resting. But within, the threads were binding tighter. A letter summoning a woman to wait, a man who returned home only after midnight. A death too neatly attributed to chance. He thought again of her figure in the rain, the stubborn patience in her posture. She had been certain of something, certain enough to wait for hours. That certainty, Maigret knew, would not dissolve into coincidence. He walked slowly back toward the Seine, his coat collar turned up against a rising wind. The city went on indifferently. Bicycles rattled, trams clanged, children ran with satchels. Yet the image of the woman clung to him, and with it the sense that beneath these ordinary facades lay currents of longing, deceit, despair. He had only just entered the case, and already it felt less like an official duty than like an obligation imposed by her silent vigil. She had waited beside the wrong door, but perhaps the door itself was not so wrong after all. The afternoon held a grey light that made the facades along Rue de Lille appear exhausted, as if the buildings had not slept. Maigret chose the café opposite the pension, the one where the zinc counter always smelled faintly of oranges and stale beer, and took a small table near the window. He set his hat on the chair beside him and let the bowl of his pipe warm in his palm without lighting it. When the waiter brought coffee, Maigret nodded his thanks and returned his gaze to the door of the pension, half hidden by the awning where the woman had stood. He was not waiting for anything in particular. He was waiting in the way he knew best, letting the air and the people of the street tell him what they could, without asking them. Regulars came and went. At 3, the delivery boy from the bakery, Capescu, came in for a lemonade. He leaned on the counter and recounted to the waiter the morning's commotion at the pension across the way. He said he had seen a woman standing there last night, dressed too light, like she thought the rain would be polite, and that she had asked him the time. Twice, he said, proud to be noticed. Once was just after 7, and then again around 8. She looked not afraid, more like someone who's decided on a thing and won't let go. The boy glanced toward Maigret with the curiosity of a child who senses a policeman but isn't sure. When he left, he rode his bicycle slowly, craning his neck at the doorway that had lately become the center of the street's murmurs. A little later, the tobacconist from next door came across for a coffee and sat near Maigret with a sigh that suggested business was poor and the weather to blame. He spoke as people do when they're alone with their thoughts and a stranger seems safe. "It's an unlucky door," he said, jerking his chin toward the pension. "Too many letters go through it and few replies come back." He meant, perhaps, a kind of melancholy in the tenants' lives, the sort that collects in cheap rooms with thin walls. Then, as if remembering something, he added, "Yesterday evening a man stopped there, at about 9:15, I think. Stood under the awning as if to shelter from the rain, but he wasn't wet. He watched the door for a moment and then left. I don't know if he spoke to her. Hard to see from the shop." He shrugged. "Could have been anyone. Everyone looks alike in the rain." Maigret did not correct him. He sipped his coffee and let the detail attach itself to the others. The letter, the hour, the woman's stillness, a man who wasn't wet. Toward 4, he pushed back his chair and crossed the street to the pension. The concierge had regained the stiffness of her post, sorrow turned practical by routine. In her lodge, the smell of cabbage and soap hung in the air, and a black cat watched, unblinking, from the top of a cupboard. Maigret stood with his hat in his hands, not to disarm her, but because it pleased him to be received as a man, not as the law. "You said Monsieur Besson returned after midnight," he began. "I heard his step," she replied, then turned her eyes toward the register on her desk, as if it might correct her memory should he insist. "He works late often. Sometimes he comes home with a cough on him, so I keep soup in the pot. But last night I already slept." "Does he receive callers?" She hesitated at the word as though it implied something improper that she did not wish to be thought to know about. "Not many," she said at last. "Once or twice a colleague from the office, a quiet man." She glanced at the cat, as if it might confirm the point. "He pays on time, keeps no trouble." Her eyes slid to the door of the hall, to the spot where the woman had lain. "This morning," she added in a softer voice, "I found a matchbook on the floor that wasn't there before. From Le Petit Dauphin, the bar over by Rue du Bac. We don't allow smoking in the hall." Maigret nodded, turning the matchbook over in his fingers. The paper was slightly damp, as if it had known the rain. He placed it in his pocket. "If he returns," he said, "I'd like a word with him." He left his card, not because it would be needed, but because the ritual of leaving the card reassured people. It suggested civility in the face of unpleasantness. He returned to the café, ordered a beer this time, and watched the street thicken with late afternoon errands. The wind had shifted. The awning above the pension flapped and settled, flapped and settled. He tried to imagine the woman's hours. 7 o'clock, 8, 9. The letter had set 9 as the meeting time. Had she read it by a cafe window, lips moving a little over each word? Had she folded it carefully, smoothing the creases with a gesture practiced over years of smoothing other small worries? She had obeyed its instructions to wait, to speak to no one, and obedience itself had become fatal. Shortly after 5, a thin man in a grey suit turned into the street with a gait that suggested fatigue was his habit. He carried a briefcase. He did not hurry, yet he did not dawdle either. His steps were measured, as if counted. He paused at the pension door, hand on the handle, and in that moment his head turned, almost imperceptibly, toward the cafe window where Maigret sat. Not because he recognized him, because some reflex in people tells them when they are observed. Then he went inside. Maigret set down his glass and followed. In the hall, the concierge straightened with a readiness that betrayed her eagerness to see official hands on a situation that had unsettled her. "Monsieur Besson," she said with a hint of triumph, "Inspector Maigret would like a word." Besson was not quite as tall as his suit suggested. He had a narrow face and a mouth that, when closed, looked as though it had once been accustomed to smiling but had forgotten how. His hair was combed flat, and there was a patch of damp on his sleeve, not from rain but from brushing against a wet wall in a narrow street. He looked at Maigret with a composed politeness rather than surprise. "I won't keep you long," Maigret said, as if apologizing for something in advance. "Perhaps in your room. It's only that the hall has too many ears." Besson showed him in. The room was neat, but the neatness came from lack of possessions rather than order. On the table stood a cup turned upside down over a saucer to keep dust away, a bottle with 2 fingers of Dubonnet, and a wooden bowl with keys and small coins. The window gave on to a blank wall. Maigret remained standing, his hat left on the chair so that his presence could be felt without appearing to settle in. "You heard," he said quietly, "that a woman died in your hall this morning." Besson's eyes went, not to the floor where she had been, but to the table, as though the question touched something he kept there. "The concierge told me just now," he answered. "It's tragic. Was she a tenant?" "No." Maigret watched him, not the words. One hand closed over the other, whitening the knuckles and then relaxing with an effort. She had been waiting. For some hours. For whom? That is what I'm trying to understand. Besson nodded and rubbed a thumb along the edge of the table. Once, twice. "I wish I could help," he said, in the tone of a man who has practiced the sentence for various situations. "I have to say, I arrived late last night." "After midnight." "After midnight," he agreed. "We had a rush at the office." He hesitated, then added, "Insurance. End of month. Forms, policies. It's not glamorous. Do you often leave by the side door?" The question was casual, almost whimsical. Besson glanced toward the hall as if measuring the distances in his mind. "Number, I come and go by the main door." Maigret lifted the matchbook, placed it on the table between them without a word. Besson's eyes flickered. "I don't smoke," he said. It was true. There was no smell of tobacco on him, and his fingers did not carry the faint stain of nicotine. "Perhaps a visitor." "Do you receive visitors?" "Sometimes a colleague. I'm not, a social man." "Last night?" "No." A small pause, then, "No one." Maigret let the silence lengthen until it became a presence between them. The bulb in the ceiling hummed. The building's pipes gurgled like a stomach. He reached into his pocket and unfolded the damp letter he had found in the woman's bag. He did not hand it to Besson, only looked at it himself and said, "If you would be so kind, I need to file a record of your hours yesterday." Nothing formal. The simplest is if you write it here, from when you left the office to when you returned home. He found a sheet of paper and a pen in the bowl. Besson took the pen. His hand did not tremble, but he held the pen too tightly at first, leaving a small blot at the beginning of his sentence before adjusting. He wrote in neat, upright characters, each letter separated, the hand of a man trained to fill out forms where legibility is a virtue. The words were ordinary. Left office at 10:30. Stopped for a drink at Le Petit Dauphin. Arrived home after midnight. Le Petit Dauphin. The matchbook. So he did go. Maigret nodded, as if satisfied to have something practical. "Who did you drink with?" "Myself," Besson said, and if there was a faint defensiveness, it could be attributed to loneliness rather than deceit. "It helps sleep." "I understand." Maigret folded the paper and slipped it into his pocket with the letter. He stood, and for a moment the two men faced one another in the narrow space as the rest of the building breathed around them. "If you remember anything else, anyone waiting, anyone asking a question, leave a note with the concierge. I'll be nearby." In the hall, the concierge had arranged herself so that she could see them part without appearing to watch. "A quiet man," she repeated, as if the phrase were a charm against trouble. "He keeps to himself." Then, lowering her voice, "But last week I heard him in the night, talking, not loud, like a man talking into his own hands." She looked ashamed for having noticed. Outside, the wind had picked up, carrying with it the smell of the river. Maigret paused under the awning where the woman had stood. He tried, without effort, to place Besson here in the rain, to picture his face when he found the doorway blocked by a figure who would not be moved. It was not that he believed Besson a liar. The man had the tired look of someone incapable of the theatrics that lies still demand. But there was a seam somewhere in the fabric of these hours, a weak stitch that would give if he pressed gently enough in the right place. He walked to Rue du Bac and found Le Petit Dauphin by the laughter that leaked out of its door each time a customer entered. The afternoon crowd had thinned. The barman was polishing glasses with a cloth that had absorbed 100 stories. When Maigret gave his name, the barman's eyebrows ticked up in recognition of a kind of fame he could respect. "We don't see many policemen at this hour unless they're hiding," he said, amiably wary. "Did you have a customer last night?" Maigret asked. "A quiet man in a grey suit, alone, who didn't smoke." The barman gestured to a corner table near the mirror. "Sat there from after 10 until near midnight. 2 Dubonnays, then a coffee." He cocked his head. "Read the newspaper like it was a wall." "Speak to anyone?" "Not until just before he left. A woman came in, not the kind who belongs to bars, the kind who keeps one glove on while she fumbles for coins with the other hand. She stood behind his chair for a moment, then sat 2 stools down. They didn't talk at first. Then he turned, said maybe 3 sentences. She answered once. They left separately. What did they say?" The barman's mouth spread into the half-smile of a man who resists the fancy of being a witness. "I'm not the post," he said. "I don't read letters." He thought a moment. He said, 9 o'clock won't do." She said, "It must." Then he paid, and the way he put the coins down, like he'd decided to be done with deciding. When Maigret stepped back onto the street, evening had begun to creep in, not with darkness, but with a thinning of light, as if the day had been poured away. He lit his pipe at last, the first draw steady, and stood a long moment watching the people passing. The woman had waited because a letter told her to. The man had said 9 o'clock would not do, and yet she went to the door at 9 and waited until the hours emptied her. In Maigret's mind, the 2 images overlapped and did not fit. The seam he was looking for tugged again, finer now, almost musical. He turned toward the river, toward the quay, knowing there would be forms to sign, reports to endure, words to exchange with colleagues who would look for bruises and forget the kind people carry inside. He was tired, but not weary. The city had settled into its evening self, and somewhere behind a wrong door, someone had written a letter in a hurry. That haste, more than the rain, more than the silence, felt like the beginning of the truth. He tucked his pipe into the corner of his mouth, where it found its old place like a key in a lock, and walked on. The quay was warm and stale when he returned, as if the building had spent the afternoon breathing through a damp cloth. In the corridor, a radiator ticked, and from somewhere a typewriter hammered and stopped, like a heartbeat forgetting itself. Maigret set his hat on the peg inside his office and laid the letter on the blotter. He read it again, not for the words. He could have recited them now, but for the way they were arranged. Do not come earlier. Do not speak to anyone. We will resolve everything then. The verb held him. Resolve. It was office language, the sort of word men used when they meant to straighten a file, not a life. It didn't belong to the woman he had watched under the awning, whose vocabulary, he imagined, would bend to the weather and to supper, not to resolutions. Lognon came to the door with his usual air of having been personally affronted by the weather. He hovered, unsure if he should step in, and finally did because his gloom preferred company. "They'll call it a natural death," he announced, as if accusing someone of stinginess. "The precinct doctor says heart. He says the only mystery is why everyone thinks it's a mystery." Maigret let the corner of his mouth move. "And you?" "I," said Lognon. "Say, when people die at respectable hours, in respectable places, that's for the city to swallow. When they die at a pension doorway in the rain with a letter in their bag, that's for us to chew." He scratched the side of his nose. "Your man downstairs, the coroner, he'll send you a note. He doesn't like to sound like a man who could be wrong." "You saw the letter?" "I saw you with it," Lognon said. "It looks like letters that never sign themselves." "That's all." He gave a short nod that meant he had used up his quota of pessimism for the hour and left, closing the door as if it might otherwise wander away. When the note came, it was brief and tidy as the doctor's spectacles. No signs of poison. A chronic weakness of the heart suggested by old scarring. Exposure and fatigue likely contributory. Stomach mostly empty. Traces of coffee. No rings, no necklace, no identification. Maigret held the page between two fingers. No rings. He thought of the barman's observation. The glove kept on as if the hand had something to hide. He had not looked closely at the hands, not for rings. The face had been enough. He felt an old impatience with himself, not sharp, but steady, like the impatience one feels at having forgotten to shut a window before rain. He put away the letter and the note and locked the drawer, not because there was danger of theft, but because it was his habit to mark the moment when a case settled into him. It was nearly 7. He was aware of his own hunger in the precise way he was aware of everything when a question had fixed itself in him, as a fact at the edge of vision, dim and insistent. Dinner was boiled beef and carrots and a sauce. Madame Maigret had the trick of making taste like something both modest and indulgent. She had a way of watching him that was not watchful. She did not pry, but that made his silences feel companioned. He told her what he could tell anyone. A woman waiting, a door, a letter. His voice was quiet. The steam from the pot misted, the kitchen window. "She kept one glove on," he said, half to himself. "In the bar. The barman noticed that." "That's what I used to do," Madame Maigret said, without looking up from the plate she was drying. "When I was younger and went out to buy thread if the ring was loose. Paris snatches small things. A glove holds it." "So she was hiding a ring," Maigret murmured. "Hiding it from the city, perhaps," she said, "or from a person." She laid the plate on the towel with the carefulness of someone placing an idea where it would not be broken. If she had taken it off before meeting someone, she might have left it in the glove and forgotten it, or she might have remembered it too late. He thought of the morgue's list. No rings. He thought of the single glove, maintained like a small act of defiance in a bright place that didn't suit her. He thought of the letter's imperative to silence. He ate, tasted nothing, and then tasted everything at once. a flood that told him he had been hungry for more than food. After coffee, he walked back out, the evening having thinned to a damp that clung to the beard and the brim of the hat. The streets had taken on their night voices, the murmur of steps, the rattle of a dish through an open window, a radio too loud 2 floors up, and then abruptly turned down. He did not go at once to the bar. He went to the morgue. There is a particular smell to that place, neither purely medical nor purely something else, that even men who have worked 30 years on the quay can never name but always recognize. The attendant, a man with hands like bread, nodded him in with the respect reserved for those who come not out of duty but out of something less clear. The woman lay under the sheet with that modesty the dead reclaim, not from the living, but from themselves. He folded back the linen as far as her wrists. Her hands were small, the nails trimmed short. A tiny crescent of ingrained soap showed at the base of one, as if she washed other people's things as often as her own. On the ring finger of the left hand there was a pale band, the skin slightly grooved where a circle had been for years. Removal had left a faint redness along the crease, recent, as if done without habit. There was a pinprick scar near the thumb. Old, he imagined, needlework, or the small accidents of kitchens. "No ring?" he asked, though he knew the answer. The attendant shook his head. "We collect what is there," he said with a shrug that apologized for the world. On the way out, Maigret paused in the little office where such small objects are recorded when they exist. There was nothing to record for her. He felt no triumph in being right about the absence. He felt only the quiet tightening of the thread. He thanked the attendant and walked into the raw air. At Le Petit Dauphin, the barman was arranging bottles with the pride of a man lining up his children for a photograph. The place had taken off the afternoon and put on the elastic cheer of evening. When he saw Maigret, he reached for the glass he knew the inspector liked for beer, then thought better of it and set out a coffee cup instead. "You mentioned," Maigret said without preface, "that the woman kept one glove on." "She did," the barman said. "It made me think of my sister, who always says a bar is a place where you should look as though you've just stepped in by mistake." "Did she leave anything behind when she left?" "We keep a drawer for such things," the barman said, and it was true. There is always a drawer. He ducked, rattled, and came up with a single glove, the left of cheap brown kid. It was damp at the cuff when found, he explained, and he had dried it by the boiler. He put it on the counter, and the leather made a small private sound against the zinc. "May I?" "Of course." Maigret lifted the glove as one lifts something that may break, although it will not. It smelled faintly of powder and city dust. He pressed the fingers. The ring finger yielded and then resisted. He pinched, and a hard circle nudged forward inside the leather like a coin moving through cloth. He turned the glove and coaxed the thing out into his palm. It was a plain gold band, too thin to be fashionable, too heavy to be a trinket. Inside the hoop, the engraving had been worn down by years of skin and soap, but the letters were still legible if the light was inclined to be kind. L.R. J.R. and a date that could have been 1926 or 1928, the 2 and the 8 confiding in each other. The barman leaned in despite himself, then leaned back, remembering he was not a participant. "She didn't want to lose it," he said softly, "or she didn't want it seen." Maigret slipped the ring into his pocket and laid a 10-franc note on the counter with fingers that were more deliberate than his mind. He thought of the delivery boy and the 2 questions about the hour. He thought of the tobacconist's unlucky door. He thought of Besson's neat handwriting. "We will resolve everything," then would have been a sentence he might write without hearing that the words belonged to files and not to feelings. And yet the barman had heard him say, 9 o'clock won't do. The seam pulled again. Back on the street, the pension's awning hung like a tired eyelid. The concierge was not in her lodge. Only the cat held the post. In the window of the tobacconist's, rows of cigarettes stood at attention with small price cards as epaulettes. Across at the cafe, the boy from the bakery had been replaced by two men in aprons arguing quietly over a racing sheet. The city, called to witness, had gone back to declaring itself ordinary. He stood where she had stood and looked not at the door, but at the street, the way one looks out from a cell to remember there is a world. If she had taken off her ring in order to become someone else for an hour, someone whose hand did not tell a story at first glance. Then she had done it in a place with mirrors and noise, a place where people pretend not to notice one another noticing. If she had put the ring in the glove to keep it safe, it meant she had expected to come back to herself later. A woman does not fold herself up for good without some ceremony. The letter had promised a ceremony of a kind. We will resolve everything then. The ritual had been fixed for 9. A man had said 9 would not do. He pictured Besson at his small table with his newspaper held like a wall, the coffee cooling because he was looking into his own thoughts instead of the cup. He pictured the woman 2 stools away, one glove on, the other hidden around her ring. Not a conversation, a negotiation of timetables and consciences. He had said no to 9, and still she had gone to the door at 9, because the letter told her to, and because sometimes the person who writes is the person we decide to obey. There was a second presence here, not merely as shadow, but as ink and instruction. He walked without hurry toward the river, where the wind thought itself braver than it was. Tomorrow he would go to the insurance office and look at colleagues who used the word resolve when they spoke of people. He would ask the concierge for the tenant's pockets of absence, who had been at home at 9 and who had acquired dry shoes in wet weather. He would hold the ring to the light in Janvier's hand and say nothing while the younger man said what needed saying. He would ask the barman if the woman drank anything or if she only pretended to have a reason to stay. He would ask the baker's boy if she smiled when she asked him the time and whether the smile made him speak faster or slower. For the moment, he let the pipe stay unlit and the questions be questions. Suspicion, in him, was not a flare, but a barometer. The needle had dropped. He felt it in the way the city pressed against his coat, in the word that did not belong in a woman's purse, in the ring heavy in his pocket with the warmth of a hand no longer there. The next morning, the fog on the Seine hung low and close, flattening the bridges into shadows that seemed less built than remembered. Maigret stood at his office window before the day had properly begun, the ring on the blotter before him, the letter beside it. The gold band caught the weak light and held it stubbornly, as though refusing to admit its wearer had been reduced to a case file. He tamped his pipe, listening to the murmur of the quay waking up, the shuffle of clerks, the scrape of chairs, a cough echoing down the hall. Janvier appeared in the doorway with his usual briskness, young enough to disguise fatigue with enthusiasm. "We put out a circular this morning," he said, "to see if anyone reports a missing woman matching her description." "Nothing yet." He glanced at the ring, then at Maigret. "Married, then?" "Married, yes," Maigret said, as if marriage were a condition as natural as rain. "But to whom, and whether still, that's another matter." He nudged the ring slightly with his thick finger. "She took it off. She hid it. People don't hide what they're proud of." Janvier hesitated. If she was waiting at Besson's door, it could mean many things. Maigret interrupted, but not unkindly. It could mean she expected a word, or an end, or a beginning, but it does not yet mean that Besson killed her. At 9, he walked the short distance to the insurance office where Besson worked. The building was not imposing, a square facade with too many windows, the kind of place where routine lived its life on lined paper. Inside, clerks bent over ledgers at long desks, their pens moving in unison like a field of scythe. A smell of ink and damp wool lingered in the air. The manager, a balding man with pince-nez, came bustling when Maigret introduced himself, eager to be of service, yet equally eager to distance his establishment from scandal. "Monsieur Besson?" "Yes, a reliable man, quiet, always punctual." He had a backlog last night, stayed until after 10. A conscientious worker, if not a brilliant one. The manager's voice carried the faint disdain of men who value brilliance above reliability. Do many of your clerks use the phrase, resolve everything in letters? Maigret asked mildly. The manager blinked. Resolve? Why, naturally. It's our profession. Policies, claims, disputes. Everything must be resolved. It is the language of insurance, Inspector. Maigret nodded. That much fit. He turned his attention to a young woman at the far desk, who had been listening while pretending to write. She wore a dress too thin for the season, her hair pinned hastily, a smudge of ink on her wrist. When their eyes met, she flushed and bent closer over her page. He walked over slowly, and the silence of the room thickened as the other clerks tried not to look. You know Monsieur Besson well? He asked quietly. The young woman raised her head, startled at being singled out. He is polite, she said, but not much for conversation. He leaves at different hours than the rest. Did you see him leave last night? She shook her head. I left earlier, around 8. Her voice trembled slightly, not from guilt, but from the fear of being caught in something she didn't understand. Maigret let her be. He had learned to leave people with their fears until they grew into words of their own accord. When he stepped back onto the street, the fog was lifting, though slowly, as if reluctant to show Paris in its full shape. He walked without direction, letting his feet take him toward Rue du Bac. The bar was closed, its shutters still drawn. A milk cart rattled by, the horse steaming in the chill. He thought again of the woman's glove, the ring, the faint band of red on her finger. A marriage once, certainly. So separation, perhaps, or a husband who had cast her aside. At midday he returned to the pension. The concierge was at her lodge, shelling peas into a bowl with the look of someone who had been waiting to talk. She nodded him inside before he spoke. Something has come, she said, producing an envelope. Delivered by post this morning, addressed to Monsieur Besson. I thought, since... She left the sentence unfinished, her hands busy with the peas again, as though innocence could be measured in vegetables. Maigret turned the envelope in his hand. It was ordinary, addressed in the same neat hand as the letter found in the woman's bag. He opened it carefully. Do not fail me this time. 9 o'clock. Rue de Lille. You owe me that much. The words were short, impatient, the loops of the letters pressed too deeply into the paper as if written in haste or anger. He slipped it into his pocket, feeling the thread pull tighter. Did Besson receive many letters here? He asked. Sometimes, the concierge said cautiously. Not often, he was discreet. From the same hand? She hesitated, then nodded. I think so. A woman's hand, perhaps. The letters had no return address. Upstairs, the hallway seemed narrower than before. The door to Besson's room was shut, silent. Maigret stood before it, pipe in hand, as if listening to the wood. Then he turned back to the stairs. The time was not yet right. That evening he returned again to Le Petit Dauphin. The barman greeted him with recognition, though without surprise. Policemen had their habits as much as drinkers did. The glove drawer was shut now, the evidence gone, but the memory remained. Tell me, Maigret asked, when the woman came in, was she wearing both gloves at first? The barman frowned, searching his memory. I think so, yes. She took one off to look in her purse. She left the other on. That's when I noticed. Why? Because the ring was already hidden, Maigret murmured. He let the silence rest, then asked, and when she left, did anyone follow her? The barman shook his head. No one. She walked out alone. He stayed 5 minutes longer, finished his coffee, then left. They did not leave together. Alone, waiting. The picture sharpened slowly. She had walked into the rain carrying a letter that commanded her to wait at 9. She had obeyed, even when told otherwise. and she had died with the obedience still clutched in her hand. Back at the quay, the night was heavy with reports. Janvier handed him a slip of paper, a missing persons inquiry filed in Montparnasse by a man named Roland. His wife, Jeanne Roland, had not returned home the previous night. 40 years old. Dark hair, slim build. Last seen leaving the apartment around 6, wearing a brown coat, light scarf, and kid gloves. Maigret read it twice, though once was enough. Roland. The ring had been engraved L.R. J.R. He folded the slip and placed it beside the band. The case had given him its name, and with it a direction. He summoned Janvier and told him to bring in Monsieur Roland quietly, without fuss, and to arrange for him to come to the quay the next morning. Then he extinguished his lamp, sat in the dark for a while, and listened to the city moving outside like a tide. The woman had been named now. Jeanne Roland. A name like any other, a name to be spoken over coffee, to be shouted from a window when dinner was ready, to be written in the loops of a ring. A name, and a silence that waited to be filled. When he finally left the office, the drizzle had begun again. It painted the cobbles and blurred the lamps, the city returning to the mood in which it had first offered him the image of a woman waiting at the wrong door. He walked slowly toward home, his pipe unlit, his steps steady. Tomorrow the husband would come, and with him perhaps the truth, though not all at once. Truth never arrived all at once. It seeped, it sighed, it admitted itself in small ways until at last it could no longer be denied. And Maigret, as always, would wait. The following morning the light was thin, reluctant, the kind that made the Seine look more like pewter than water. Maigret had arrived earlier than usual, as though the weight of the case had tugged him from bed before the clock. He sat at his desk, pipe unlit, the ring on the blotter beside the folded slip of paper naming Jeanne Roland. The name had not altered the case so much as settled it, like a puzzle piece that, when fitted, makes the surrounding shapes inevitable. He listened to the shuffle of footsteps in the corridor and the scrape of a chair in the next office, small signs of life beginning in a building that trafficked in endings. At 9:30, Janvier tapped and opened the door. Behind him stood a man whose expression was not grief, at least not yet, but a kind of restless defiance, as if grief had been postponed until it was certain to be necessary. He was well dressed, though his tie was knotted too tightly, and the flesh at his jaw sagged slightly over his collar. His eyes darted around the room before settling on Maigret. "Monsieur Roland?" Maigret asked, his tone quiet, not unkind. "Yes." The man's voice was brisk, almost impatient. "My wife. I was told—" He stopped, swallowing the words. "Please sit down." Roland sat, folding his hands too tightly in his lap, then unfolding them, drumming one finger on the armrest. Maigret watched in silence long enough for the man to become aware of his own fidgeting. Then he reached across the desk and placed the ring in front of him. Roland's eyes fixed on it, and something in his face collapsed inward. He did not reach for it immediately, but when he did, his fingers trembled as though the band were hotter than it should have been. He turned it once, twice, reading the engraving inside as if he didn't know what it said. Then he set it down carefully. "It is hers," he said, his voice, now hushed, stripped of the briskness. "Jeanne's. She was found," Maigret said, "outside a pension on Rue de Lille. She had been waiting. There was a letter in her handbag." He slid the folded paper across the desk. Roland picked it up, unfolded it with stiff hands, and read. His lips moved silently, and his jaw clenched. "Who wrote this?" His voice rose slightly, then dropped again. "Not her. She would not write this. Number." It was written to her. Roland pressed the heel of his hand to his forehead, shutting his eyes. "She left the apartment at 6. She said she was meeting a friend. I didn't ask more. We had been quarreling. About what? His eyes flicked open, darting toward Maigret and then away. Small things. Money. Company she kept. She was restless. Lately more so. Company? Maigret prompted. Holland shifted in his seat. She had acquaintances. People I did not care for. Men sometimes who gave her too much attention. He sighed heavily. I don't mean she was unfaithful. Only that she enjoyed being admired. She was not content at home. Do you know a man named Besson? Roland shook his head slowly. Number, should I? He works at an insurance office. She was waiting at his door. Roland's eyes widened, then narrowed. That man? Number John had no reason to. She didn't even know such people. He spoke too quickly, as if trying to persuade himself. Maigret did not press further. He leaned back, letting the silence fill the office, the muffled sounds of typewriters and footsteps outside wrapping around them. Roland shifted again, now restless under the weight of a silence that seemed heavier than words. Finally, he asked, How did she die? Her heart, Maigret said simply. She waited for hours in the rain. She was found in the early morning. Roland's mouth worked as if forming words he could not choose. He rubbed his temple with his thumb and finally whispered, Alone. Yes, Maigret said. The man nodded once, sharply, as though he had confirmed something long suspected. He rose abruptly. If you need me again, we will, Maigret said. For now, go home. We'll arrange for the formalities. Roland hesitated, glanced once more at the ring, then left. The door closed, and Maigret sat smoking at last, the room thick with the first tendrils of blue smoke. He thought of the man's restless fingers, his quick denial of Besson, his unease at the word alone. Husbands often lied, but not always to protect themselves. Sometimes they lied because the truth about their wives wounded their pride more than their conscience. In the afternoon he returned to the pension. The concierge, who seemed to have been waiting for him, leaned forward eagerly as he entered her lodge. Besson is upstairs, she whispered. He came home early today. Maigret climbed the narrow stairs, the wood creaking under his weight, and knocked gently. Besson opened the door at once, as if expecting him. He looked paler than before, his eyes ringed with fatigue. May I come in? Maigret asked. Besson stepped aside. The room was unchanged, the same neatness of poverty, the same bottle of Dubonnet on the table. There has been an identification, Maigret said. The woman was Jeanne Roland. Something flickered in Besson's face. Recognition, perhaps, quickly masked. His voice, when he spoke, was even. I don't know the name. You knew the woman. I saw her once, yes, he admitted. At the bar. She approached me, said she wanted to talk. I told her I wasn't the man she wanted. But she came here, Maigret said softly. Besson's hands tightened on the back of a chair. I didn't ask her to. She had the wrong idea. Perhaps she mistook me for someone else. It happens. Did you write to her? No. He shook his head firmly, but his eyes slid away from Maigret's. I have no reason to. I don't write letters. I live alone. I want nothing. Maigret placed the second letter, the one delivered that morning, on the table. Besson stared at it, but did not touch it. His lips pressed together, a muscle in his jaw twitching. You owe me that much, Maigret read aloud. Does that sound like a stranger's words to you? Besson sank into the chair, his shoulders slumping. I don't know why she came. I didn't want this. I didn't want any of it. His voice cracked slightly, but he did not cry. He looked more like a man cornered by something he could not name than one guilty of crime. Maigret left him with his silence. In the hall, the concierge was waiting, her curiosity poorly hidden. Well? She asked. Maigret shook his head, not at her, but at the walls themselves, which seemed to absorb secrets like damp. That evening, back at home, Madame Maigret served soup and a small roast. She listened as he spoke in fragments, as he always did, offering only what could be spoken without betraying confidences. He mentioned the husband's denial, the clerk's evasions, the letters written in haste. "You said she waited in the rain," Madame Maigret said, ladling soup into his bowl. "A woman doesn't wait so long unless she hopes to change something. Not to end it, no, to change it. That's what it sounds like to me." Her words, casual as they were, pressed against Maigret's thoughts. To change something. Jeanne Roland had gone out with her ring hidden, her glove concealing what her hand might betray. She had carried letters written by another's hand. She had obeyed instructions she both doubted and believed. To change something, yes, perhaps that was why she had waited. Later, when the city was quiet and his wife slept beside him, Maigret lay awake, listening to the soft rain against the shutters. He thought of the seam he had felt from the beginning, the small gap between Besson's weary denials and Jeanne's obedience to a command. He thought of Roland's restless pride, his insistence that his wife knew no such man, and he thought of the word that did not belong in her purse: resolve. The truth was there, like a shadow behind a door, waiting for the right moment to step into the hall. Maigret knew he would have to wait too. The city itself seemed to breathe with him, slow and patient, holding its secrets a little longer. The next day was brighter, but the light only made the streets look worn, as though Paris had been scrubbed too hard and left raw. Maigret walked slowly toward the quay, the pipe in his pocket instead of his mouth, his thoughts circling without hurry, but without pause. The name of the woman, Jeanne Roland, now sat on the case like a weight, and yet the shape of her waiting, her obedience to that letter, was still the puzzle. She had been summoned, and she had gone. The man who had summoned her had denied it. The husband had denied knowing the man, and somewhere between those denials was the seam that would give way. When he reached his office, Janvier was waiting with a thin file under his arm. "Background on Roland," he said, handing it over. "Runs a shop in Montparnasse. Stationery and newspapers. Decent trade, not rich but steady. Married to Jeanne 20 years. No children. Neighbors say she was sociable, liked to talk. He, less so." Maigret leafed through the papers without haste. There were fragments of a life. Addresses, dates, the sort of facts that looked complete until one remembered how much of life went unrecorded. He closed the file and leaned back, eyes half closed. "Sociable," he repeated. "That word covers many sins." "Do you think he knew?" Janvier asked quietly. "I think he suspected something," Maigret said. "But suspicion and knowledge are not the same, and pride is not truth." He rose and stretched, his heavy frame shifting slowly, and decided it was time to see Roland again. Not in the office, but in his own shop, where the man's pride had roots. The shop in Montparnasse was narrow, its shelves lined with boxes of envelopes, ledgers, fountain pens in neat rows under glass. Behind the counter, Roland stood with his sleeves rolled, sorting newspapers into piles with quick, efficient movements. His expression tightened when he saw Maigret, but he nodded stiffly. "Inspector." "May I?" Maigret asked, gesturing toward the little side room where customers sometimes sat to discuss orders. Roland hesitated, then led the way. The room smelled of paper and dust. A small stove ticked in the corner. Maigret removed his hat and sat, letting the silence settle. Roland shifted, rubbed his hands on his trousers, then said abruptly, "What more do you want from me?" "You told me yesterday. She's dead. Do you need me to say I grieve?" "I do." Maigret did not move. His eyes were steady, heavy, the kind of gaze that unsettled by being so patient. "You told me she had acquaintances you did not approve of." Roland's jaw clenched. "Yes, she was, lonely. She wanted more than I could give, always wanted to be seen, noticed. By men like Besson. I told you, I don't know this Besson. Maigret leaned forward slightly. But she did. She wrote to him, or he to her. We have letters. Roland's face colored. Then he's the one. If he lured her there, did she often go out in the evenings? A pause. More often lately. Said she was visiting a friend or going to the cinema. I let her. What was I to do? Follow her like a detective? His mouth twisted. That's your work, not mine. Maigret's pipe remained in his pocket, but he rolled it between his fingers as though considering how best to tamp the truth. She hid her ring, he said quietly. Why? Roland's eyes flickered, then dropped. Perhaps she didn't want to be seen as married. Perhaps she was ashamed of me. Does it matter now? It matters to me, Maigret said, rising. And it should matter to you. He left Roland there, the man's shoulders hunched as though under an invisible load. Outside, the street noise rushed back like a tide. Trams rattling, schoolchildren shouting, a woman bargaining at a vegetable stall. Life indifferent as ever. That afternoon he returned to Besson. The clerk opened the door reluctantly, his face pale, his eyes with the red rims of someone who had slept poorly. Maigret entered without ceremony, filled the little room with his bulk, and sat down without being asked. You've denied writing the letters, he said. But they were written by a man who uses the word resolve. That is your world, isn't it? Besson rubbed his hands together, a nervous rhythm. It could be anyone from the office. The word is common. It doesn't mean me. And yet she waited at your door. I don't know why. His voice broke slightly. I swear I don't. She was kind, perhaps too kind. She thought I was someone who could... He stopped, pressing his lips tight. Could what? Could change her life, but I couldn't. I have no life to give. I'm a shadow in an office. He laughed bitterly at himself. She mistook me for someone. Yet she died at your door. Besson buried his face in his hands. I told her not to come. At the bar, I told her 9 o'clock wouldn't do. She insisted. She said I owed her. But I owed her nothing. Nothing. His voice rose with a kind of desperation that sounded more like fear than guilt. Maigret watched him quietly until the room grew still again. Then he rose, placed his hat back on his head, and said simply, If you remember otherwise, you know where to find me. Outside, the street was heavy with late afternoon damp. The tobacconist leaned on his doorway, smoking, and nodded to Maigret. People still talk, he said. About the woman. They say she wasn't the first to wait there. Once, weeks ago, another woman stood outside for a long time. Different one, younger. She left before midnight, though. Didn't die, at least. He shrugged. It's an unlucky door. Maigret walked back to the quay, his mind circling that remark. Not the first. Another had waited. Jeanne had not been alone in her obedience. There was a pattern, faint but insistent. Someone wrote, summoned, demanded. Women came, waited. One had died. That night, at home, he told Madame Maigret in his slow way. She listened, knitting in her lap, the click of the needle soft against the silence. 2 women, she said. Then it wasn't love. Or not only love, it was something else. Some people can't bear being left, so they write letters to keep the others bound. They call it resolve, but it is only fear. Maigret smoked, staring into the room's lamplight. Her words pressed against his thoughts until they became part of them. Not love, but fear. Not resolve, but desperation. He thought again of Besson's weary face, Roland's restless pride, Jeanne's hidden ring. The threads were drawing together, though not yet tight. When he finally went to bed, the city outside was muffled by fog, the lamps haloed, the streets quiet. But he felt the story pressing, waiting, as Joan had waited, at the wrong door until her heart gave out. The truth was near, so near he could almost hear it breathing in the silence. The following morning the fog had lifted, and the sky, though pale, carried a brittle sharpness that made each sound on the cobblestones ring a little louder. Maigret reached the quay earlier than usual. His shoulders stooped in thought, the bowl of his pipe unlit between his teeth. He had slept poorly, turning over the image of two women, Jeanne Roland and the unnamed younger one the tobacconist had spoken of, both drawn to the same door, both obeying a summons whose author denied responsibility. There was a pattern now, faint but undeniable, and he knew that if he pressed gently enough, it would emerge. Janvier was waiting outside his office, a bundle of papers under his arm. "We've identified the handwriting," he said, lowering his voice as though the corridor itself might overhear. The letters, both the one found in Jeanne Roland's bag and the one delivered to Besson, were compared with forms from the insurance office. The style matches Besson's, at least in part, not a certainty, but close. Maigret nodded, neither satisfied nor surprised. Forms, reports, the hand of a clerk who fills in boxes and lines. He pushed open his office door, and together they went inside. On the desk lay the two letters, still faintly creased, their ink slightly blurred by rain. He studied them again, not the words but the pressure of the pen, the impatience of the strokes. The lines leaned forward as if the writer were hurrying toward something he could not quite reach. "He denies it," Janvier said, "but the concierge swears she's seen letters in the same hand arriving before. Always the same. No return address." Maigret filled his pipe slowly, tamping the tobacco with a thick finger. Men like Besson do not write for love. They write to bind, to control, to hold someone at the end of a thread. He struck a match and drew in the first heavy smoke, letting it curl in the still air. If it was only Jeanne, it might be chance. But another woman waited before. That makes it habit. By mid-morning he was once more at the pension, the awning above the door flapping lightly in the breeze, its canvas stained by years of rain. The concierge was in her lodge, peeling potatoes into a basin. She looked up quickly when Maigret entered, as though she had been listening for his steps. "You said another woman," he began, "weeks ago." "Tell me again." She frowned, setting down the knife. "I didn't see her myself. It was the tobacconist. But now that I think, yes, there was a night I heard voices in the hall, late. A woman's voice, low, insistent. I thought it was a quarrel, but it ended quickly. No shouting, just the sound of the door closing and her steps leaving fast." She hesitated. "Not Madame Roland. Younger, I think. Her shoes were lighter." "Did you tell Besson?" The concierge pursed her lips. "He doesn't confide in me, monsieur." But he looked ill the next morning, pale, like he'd not slept. Maigret nodded, thanked her, and went upstairs. He knocked gently, and after a pause, Besson opened the door. His face was drawn, the skin beneath his eyes shadowed. The room smelled of stale coffee. "You've been writing letters," Maigret said, his voice steady, almost conversational. Besson's lips parted, then closed again. He turned away, moved to the table, and sat heavily. "I told you I didn't. Two women, Besson. One younger, weeks ago. She left, then Jeanne Roland. She didn't leave." Besson pressed his hands flat against the table as if to steady himself. "They wanted something from me. They thought I could change their lives. But I couldn't. I never asked them to come." "You sent the letters." He shook his head violently. "I didn't mean harm. The words, yes, I may have written. But they were only words, not orders, not commands." His voice broke on the last phrase, and he buried his face in his hands. Maigret let the silence lengthen until Besson's breathing steadied again. "Why her? Why Jeanne?" "She came to the bar," he whispered. "She spoke to me first, said she was tired of being invisible, that her husband never looked at her. She wanted to talk, to confide. I listened. That's all I did. But listening can be dangerous. People begin to believe you are theirs. I told her not to come again. She insisted. She said I owed her that much. Maigret thought of the words in the letter. You owe me that much. They had not been his after all. They had been hers, repeated back, written, in a hand not used to intimacy, only to forms, a poor imitation of feeling. She died waiting, Maigret said quietly. Besson's shoulders shook once, twice, then stilled. I didn't kill her, he murmured. But I didn't save her either. Later, back at the quay, Maigret sat with the ring in his palm, turning it slowly. Janvier entered, bringing news. We traced the younger woman. Her name's Lucienne Morel. Works at a hat shop near Saint-Sulpice. She admitted she received a letter, too, summoning her to the pension. She waited, but when no one came, she left. She said she tore up the letter, ashamed. She didn't want her fiancé to know. And the hand. She says it was Besson's. She recognized the way he wrote her name. He had filled out an insurance form for her mother months ago. Maigret closed his eyes, exhaling smoke. The pieces were aligning. Besson had written not to seduce, not to love, but to draw these women into his orbit, to make them dependent on his silent presence, his listening. He had offered nothing, promised nothing, yet they had come. And Jeanne, more desperate, had obeyed even when told not to. She had hidden her ring, hoping to change her life, and the rain had finished what his refusal had begun. In the evening, Maigret sat again at the café across from the pension, his coat collar turned up against the wind. The awning flapped above the door, the same door where she had waited. People passed, indifferent, carrying bread, leading children, laughing in small bursts. Life went on, as it always did. He watched the door a long time, his beer untouched before him. It was not guilt that interested him now, but loneliness, the kind that made a woman hide her ring in a glove and wait for hours at a stranger's summons. He thought of Jeanne Roland, of Lucienne Morel, of others perhaps unknown, all drawn to a man whose only crime was to listen and then retreat. It was enough sometimes to kill. When at last he rose and walked toward the river, the city seemed quieter, the lamps blurred in the rising mist. He would write his report tomorrow, spare in words but heavy with implication. Jeanne Roland had died of her heart, but she had also died of waiting, of hope misplaced at the wrong door. At home, over supper, Madame Maigret asked softly, "Was it solved?" Maigret nodded slowly. Solved, yes, but not resolved. He poured himself a glass of wine and sat back, listening to the rain that had begun again, as though the city itself were repeating the vigil Jeanne Roland had kept in vain. The day after, the air had a hard clarity that made even the river look precise. From the Pont Neuf, one could see the barges like dark strokes on a clean page, and Maigret, crossing without hurry, felt the case narrowing to its lines. He did not go first to the office. He turned toward Montparnasse, where the streets held the smell of bread and damp stone, and where the stationer's bell gave a small, dutiful tinkle when he pushed the door. Roland started, then set down the paper knife he had been using to open a bundle of ledgers. He looked thinner than 2 days earlier, as if sleep had skimmed him and gone on. Behind him the shelves were rectilinear consolation, blotters, quills, paste, envelopes in disciplined stacks. "I'd like to see the apartment," Maigret said, in the tone of a man asking for an ordinary favor. Roland hesitated long enough for refusal to become impossible. He nodded, flipped the counter latch, and led the way through the narrow corridor to a stair where the plaster had been rubbed shiny by years of hands. The rooms above were clean, not fussy, and carried the faint perfume of furniture polish and boiled coffee. On a chair by the window lay a scarf that still remembered a neck. The bedspread was smoothed in a way that made the bed look like a decision. He did not ransack. He stood, hat in his hands, and let the place speak. A sewing basket on a low table, a cheap novel face down beside a cup ring, On the mantel, a photograph of a younger Jean, laughing at something to the left of the camera. In the kitchen, a slim bottle with a single carnation that had given up during the night. "Where did she keep her letters?" he asked, still mild. Roland gestured to a drawer in the sideboard. Inside were household things: string, stamps, a box of envelopes from the shop below. Beneath, in a flat tin that had once held biscuits, lay a few folded papers. He did not ask permission. He took them out, sat at the small table, and opened the top one. Lists mostly. Sugar, soap, a note to remember a cousin's birthday. The hand was rounder than the office script on the letters to the pension, more domestic, the words leaning into one another as if for warmth. At the bottom of the tin was a scrap that stopped him. It was a page torn from a pamphlet, Société Générale d'Assurance, with an address penned neatly in the margin: Monsieur René Besson, Chambre 3, Pension Leblanc, Rue de Lille. Underneath, in the same hand, the hour, 9 o'clock. Beside it, as if Jeanne had been practicing what she wanted him to read, the sentence copied twice: Nous réglerons tout alors. The second time, a correction, the shaky flourish of someone borrowing a word that did not belong in her mouth. Resolve turned into settle. He held the scrap out to Roland. "Is this her hand?" Roland stared at it a long time. He did not touch it, as if the ink might leap to his fingers and burn. "Yes," he said at last, the word emerging like something pried loose. She wrote carefully when it mattered to her. She had Besson's address, Maigret said. Roland's eyes went to the window, not to the street, but to a point beyond it where memory stood. "One evening she came home with a brightness on her," he said slowly, "like a woman carrying a flame she thinks no one can see. I asked nothing. I'd already asked too much, and she had learned to answer in ways that made me feel ridiculous. Later I looked in her bag. I found a form from an insurance office, a name at the bottom. I put it back. In the morning she was kind, as if kindness could patch what had come loose in the night." "You followed her?" The question was not an accusation. "Once," he swallowed, "to a bar off Rue du Bac. She sat 2 stools from a man in a grey suit. They spoke little. When he turned, I saw his face was ordinary. That made it worse. If he had been handsome, I could have hated him properly." He gave a small, grotesque smile that died as soon as it lived. "I went home. I told myself there was nothing to tell." He stood, then sat again, elbows on his knees, head in his hands. When he spoke, it was into his palms. "I did not write letters. I did not lure her. I did not kill her. I only failed to be enough, and then I failed to be brave." Maigret let him sit in that for a while. It was not his business to comfort, only to understand. He replaced the papers in the tin, all but the scrap with the address, which he folded once and put in his pocket. In the doorway he paused, and, without looking at Roland, said, "She hid her ring but kept it near. That's not shame, so it's hope." Back at the quay, he found Janvier with 2 postmarks under a paperweight. "From the concierge's envelope," Janvier said. "It was cancelled at the Montparnasse office the afternoon before she died. 5:30. It could have been posted by her on her way to the bar." "So the letter to Besson was hers," Maigret said, "and the one in her bag, his." Janvier nodded. The comparison was sloppy, too eager. A clerk's hand looks like another clerk's hand when you squint. "People do not squint at grief," Maigret said, and put on his coat again. He didn't send for Besson. He went to him. The pension's hall held yesterday's cabbage. The cat had found new air to stare at. Upstairs, Besson opened at once, as if he had been living just behind the door, listening for steps. "She wrote to you before she died," Maigret said. "The postmark is Montparnasse. 5:30. Your letter to her came earlier. The phrases are yours, the hour is hers. At the bar you told her 9 would not do. She went anyway. Besson sat without being told to. His hands, when they fled to each other, made a small, helpless animal. "I wrote one letter," he said, as if pronouncing a sentence. "I used the word I always use at the office because I have no other word for endings. Règle. I thought if I made it sound official, it would be easier to bear. For me. For her. She had the kind of face that believes what you say if you say it quietly. I told her in the bar it was a mistake. I told her not to come." He lifted his eyes. "I didn't think she would wait." "She wasn't the first to wait here," Maigret said. He flinched as if struck. "No. And the others." He looked toward the window that saw only a wall. "I listened. They mistook listening for promise. I never promised. I liked being necessary," he said, and the word came out like a confession of theft. "It made the rooms less empty. I'm not proud. I'm only telling you what you already know." Maigret took out his pipe and held it without lighting it. "She died with your letter in her bag. That's a fact that will look like guilt to some. To me, it looks like loneliness doing the work that violence sometimes does." Besson nodded, and there was a drawn sound in the back of his throat, an attempt at speech that did not become one. He covered his mouth and tried again. "I watched the clock until midnight and then later. I did not go down. I did not look. In the morning the concierge told me and I—" He stopped, and the stop was the collapse itself. Not tears, not gestures, but a man's voice ending because there was nothing left for it to climb. "You'll come to the quay," Maigret said gently. "You'll sign a statement. You won't be charged for what the law cannot name, but you will carry it, and perhaps you will stop writing letters." Leaving, he passed the concierge, who watched with the stealth of a person whose life is the building's passage of secrets. "He's a quiet one," she said, as if that word could exculpate the stubbornness of reality. In the café opposite, the waiter set a beer down without asking. He had learned a policeman's habits like a neighbor learns the weather. Maigret did not drink. He looked at the door instead, at the awning that lifted and fell in the small wind, and thought of the sentence Jeanne had copied twice in her kitchen. "We will settle everything then. People make ceremonies of endings because they cannot bear them raw." He imagined her writing the hour carefully, the figure 9 as round as a child's. He imagined him writing a word he trusted because it had helped him fold papers neatly for years. In the afternoon, Maigret returned to Montparnasse with the ring wrapped in a handkerchief. Roland let him in like a man admitting the priest who brings no absolution. In the small room, the light was kind to nothing. Maigret placed the handkerchief on the table and opened it. The ring lay there with its worn inscription. Roland reached for it, then paused, and with a kind of wonder, not at the metal but at his own hands, slipped it onto his little finger. It stuck halfway. He left it there. "She posted a letter to him at 5:30, Maigret said. He posted one to her earlier. They planned to end it. She believed an end could be like a conversation. He believed it could be like an entry closed in a book. Neither came. Roland nodded once. Did he love her? No, Maigret said. But he made her feel like the sort of woman who could be loved. Sometimes that is more dangerous. Roland sat back, eyes on the ring that would not go further up his finger. He spoke as if to it. I used to think she talked too much. I would come upstairs and she would tell me the whole day in little pieces, as if language were all we had. I wanted quiet. I see now it was my quiet she was suffocating in. He looked up. What happens to him? He writes no more letters, Maigret said, and he learns what it is to be looked at by neighbors who don't know what they are looking at. Roland's mouth twitched, not toward a smile, but toward a human curve. And me? You learn to talk, Maigret said, and it was the sort of advice he gave rarely, because advice felt like a smaller brother of judgment. On his way back, he stopped, without plan, at Le Petit Dauphin. The barman, polishing a glass, raised his eyebrows and then put the glass down as if it had told him something. "The glove drawer is empty," he said, with the cheerfulness of a man finding the right thing to say by accident. "That's better, I think." "It is something," Maigret allowed. Outside, the afternoon had softened into a pale, washed light. He walked to the river and stood a while, arms heavy at his sides, watching the boats push slow V's in the water. Behind him, the city went on with its errands. Ahead of him, the mist made bridges into promises the eye couldn't cash. Back at the quay, he wrote the report in his square hand, careful and spare. The letters, the hour, the rain, the heart that had been weak long before it was summoned to a doorway. He did not write the sentences that mattered to him, that a woman had copied an office word into her life because she believed it might make pain orderly, that a man who listened had discovered listening is a kind of power, that a husband had learned which silences cannot be forgiven. Reports are not for that. He left the office late. The lamps had their halos back. The drizzle had returned as if on schedule. At home, Madame Maigret had kept a plate warm. He ate what she put before him. When he told her, in a few lines, she touched his sleeve and said, "There are doors one must not wait beside." He nodded, the pipe unlit, and sat a long time with her quiet in the room, which was better than any quiet he could make alone. The case did not thump in his head. It lay finally like something put down gently. He thought of the awning lifting and settling, and how even that, like breath, did not promise anything but the next small rise and fall. The drizzle held until morning, then gave up and left the windows filmed with a delicate grime that made the world look half erased. Maigret arrived at the quay with his overcoat unbuttoned, carrying the faint smell of last night's tobacco. He did not feel hurried. Cases that had reached their end did not require speed. They required the tidying of edges, the small chores that allowed the city to fold the event back into its routine. On his blotter, the report from the coroner lay with a pin through its corner, a modest act of finality. Heart-old, scarring confirmed. Exposure and strain contributing. No poisons. He read it again, not for the content, but for the tone, that practiced neutrality which made death sound like an entry in a ledger. He signed where the form asked him to sign and pushed it aside. Lognon came to the door with rain on his shoulders and a face that suggested the sky had taken its grievances personally. "So," he said, standing instead of sitting, as though the chair might trap him in optimism, "we are to learn again that waiting is not a crime, and that men who cause it do not go to prison." Maigret said, lighting his pipe. "The law is not a coat that fits every weather, nor a hat that keeps the head dry." Lognon's mouth twitched. "The younger one, Lucien, has a fiancée who would like to strike someone. He will be disappointed to learn the man he wants to strike has the kind of face one cannot strike without feeling ridiculous." He half turned. "You'll be taking statements?" "I'll be taking breath," Maigret said. "Then statements." He sent for Besson first, not with a warrant, not even with a paper, only with Janvier's quiet request and the weight of the quay behind it. The clerk arrived with his hat crushed in his hands, coat buttoned to the throat, though the corridor was warm. In the chair opposite, he sat too straight, as though his back were braced against something no one else could see. He gave the particulars in a voice that kept trying to become a whisper and was forced into audibility by the room itself. "Yes," he wrote once. Yes, he told her at the bar it must end. No, he did not wait at the door. No, he did not open it when she stood there. He had watched the clock. He had not slept. When the statement was done, Maigret slid the paper toward him. "Sign there." Besson signed carefully, the way he filled boxes at the office, each letter isolated and legible, as if being clear could make him innocent. He lifted his eyes. The lids reddened and said, not to plead but to state, "I thought listening was harmless." It is not always, Maigret said. It is a kind of promise when you have nothing else to give. Besson blinked as though the sentence had found a place in him that hurt. He rose, hat in hand, and paused with the door half open. I will leave the pension, he said. There are too many steps there I have learned by heart. That may help the building, Maigret said, but not you. He did not soften it. He did not know how. After Besson came the younger woman, Lucienne Morel, brought in by Janvier, with a gentleness that made her think herself brave for having complied. She had the careful prettiness of shop girls who know which hat flatters them and which does not. She looked around the office with quick, large eyes that touched the stove, the window, the pipe rack, as if each object confirmed a rumor about the police. She was ashamed of the letter she had received. Ashamed, too, of having waited and then gone home whole and alive while another had not. She told her piece and signed. Before leaving, she said, almost angrily, "He never even touched me." As if that omission required a category the statements did not provide. By noon, the formalities had become a pile of paper, clipped and squared. Maigret closed the drawer on them. There remained the husband. He went to Montparnasse because a man receives the worst kinds of words better in rooms where his own things can look at him. Roland had not shaved. The shop ran itself. An apprentice behind the counter, a bell ringing dutifully. In the back room, on the little table where the carnation had bowed and finally sunk its head, the ring lay in the same handkerchief where Maigret had left it. Roland had not moved it further up his finger. Perhaps he could not. He gestured toward a chair, then remained standing. "I've read her lists," Maigret said, not to surprise him, but to begin somewhere ordinary. Sugar, soap, a cousin's birthday. She wrote the hour 9 twice, as if practicing to arrive. Roland nodded once, his face arranged into an obedience that no longer had a purpose. "There will be a funeral," he said. "I have spoken to the priest. There will be those who do not come and those who come to be seen. I will not look at either." "You will have questions you cannot ask," Maigret said. "I cannot answer them, but I can tell you this much. At the bar he told her not to come. She chose to wait. The choice was hers." Roland's eyes went to the ring. "Choice is a word that matters to men," he said. "To women it is sometimes a thing that appears only after the doing." He touched the band with the edge of his finger, as if to wake it. "The shop will carry the news better than I will. Paper absorbs." When he left, the day had brightened without becoming cheerful. The sky had the pale certainty of a page rubbed thin. He walked without plan, letting the streets place themselves under his shoes. Boulevard Raspail, Rue de Sèvres, the turn that led as if by habit to Rue de Lille. The pension's awning was dry now and lifeless, its stains merely stains. The concierge lifted her chin when he entered the lodge, the cat a comma at her elbow. "He came back for his trunk," she said, anticipating the question he had not asked. "Said he's found a room near the canal. Quieter, he says, as if quiet were a thing one could choose." She wiped the rim of a cup she had already wiped. "I told him rooms follow you." "Rooms do no such thing," Maigret said, and heard, to his annoyance, that he had taken Lognon's tone. He smiled to cancel it. "Thank you." Across the street the café held its regulars, the men with aprons, now arguing about football, the woman who made a single coffee last an hour by remarkable inventions of stirring, the boy from the bakery, older by a week because he had been asked twice what time it was by, a woman who then died. The waiter set a beer down without being asked, and Maigret left it gather its small circle on the zinc. He did not want beer. He wanted to watch an empty door until it became only a door. In the afternoon the city turned brisk and practical. Errands hurried, hands were rubbed together in doorways. Letters were collected and carried to places where other hands would open them. At the quay, paper moved from one desk to another, as if compelled by a current. Maigret returned to his office and found 2 envelopes waiting, both with his name written in the upright, respectful script of people who believe officialdom will be softened by neatness. The first was from the coroner, an addendum noting the time the stomach's small residue suggested coffee had been taken, late after 10. The second was from the parish priest in Montparnasse, the ink faintly more confidential. Would the inspector, who had been informed, wish to say anything over the grave? He would not. He wrote a brief reply, "No," and found his pipe had gone out. He relit it. The flame made a brief gold in a day that had run out of bright things. The smoke steadied. The case had no more to give, and yet it continued to give small human movements like these: a priest's hopeful letter, a coroner's addendum, the concierge's cup wiped twice, the boy who knew 2 hours that would remain the most important he had been asked about. Toward evening he went home. The apartment smelled of onions softening in butter and a roast in the oven whose patience matched his. Madame Maigret wiped her hands and looked at his face and knew where he was without asking. They ate with the quiet that couples make when their talk is usually enough, but tonight would not carry the things in the room. After the plates were cleared, she returned with 2 small pears, a knife, and a question that was not a question. "You have finished," she said. "I have stopped," he corrected. She slid a quarter of pear onto his plate. Sometimes that is the same. He told her, again in pieces, as one tells a story that has learned to walk at its own pace. The letter written like a form, the hour copied like a school line, the man who liked to be necessary, the husband who would learn the sound of his own voice too late. She listened, making the small noises she made when she followed him through a labyrinth whose walls the neighbors could not see. When he finished, she said, "There are men who cannot bear to be loved. There are women who mistake being heard for being kept. The city makes many of both." He put his hand over hers on the table and left it there. They sat like that a while, hearing the upstairs neighbor move a chair a few inches and then move it back. The funeral was the next morning under a sky that refused to decide between rain and clearness and settled for a mean compromise that made the cemetery paths gleam without reflections. Maigret stood a little apart, hat in his hands as the few who must be present were present. Roland, grey and shaved, a cousin with a red nose, a woman from the hat shop with a veil she kept adjusting, the priest who did his sentences in the right order. The ring was not on Roland's finger, perhaps in his pocket, perhaps tucked into the drawer with string and stamps, where it could be something to touch and not to see. Besson did not come. He did not belong there and knew it. Maigret was grateful he knew it. Afterward, at the gate, Roland stopped him with a hand that did not quite touch his sleeve. "She would have liked it to have rained harder," he said, surprising himself. She liked weather that gave people excuses. She used them for others, Maigret said, not for herself. Roland nodded and went away, holding himself like a package that might be dropped. It was over then in the way such things are over, the papers signed, the facts attached to numbers, the living rearranged around a space where a life had been. At the quay, Maigret placed the file in the cabinet. He did not look at the spine to read the name he already knew. He returned to the window and watched the river move. The barges made their slow verbs. The city breathed. He thought, not with severity, of the phrase that had wandered from an office into a kitchen, "We will resolve everything then." He thought of a woman practicing the hour with a pencil that left a tired shine on the paper. He thought of a man who had mistaken the safety of listening for innocence, and of another who had mistaken pride for proof. None of them had intended harm. All of them had carried it in their pockets like a folded letter. He tamped his pipe, not for smoke now, but for company, and said nothing. The rain began again, softly, in the exact measure needed to make the awnings lift and settle, a city's small lungs taking in their portion of the day. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that felt less like aftermath than absorption, the way rainwater sinks slowly into stone until only the darkening remains. The file on Jean Roland had been placed in its drawer, the papers squared and signed, yet the case lingered in the air around Maigret like the faint smell of smoke in a room long emptied. He carried no triumph, no bitterness, only the heaviness that comes when a life has ended not by malice, but by the weight of its own longing. At the quay, clerks moved on to other reports. Lognon grumbled about a burglary that had stolen nothing of value. Janvier busied himself with the details of a minor fraud. The hum of typewriters returned, and in that steady rhythm, Maigret felt the city's machinery digesting one more story into anonymity. Still, in quiet moments, the image returned. Jeanne beneath the awning, her thin coat damp, her hand clutching the bag that held a letter written in borrowed words. One evening, he found himself walking without direction and arrived again on Rue de Lille. The pension stood as it had always stood, ordinary, its door opening for tenants who carried shopping baskets and closed behind them without ceremony. The awning flapped lightly in the breeze, innocent now, its stains mere weather. Across the street the cafe had filled with men arguing about a football match, their voices sharp and ordinary. No one looked at the door anymore. It had lost its mystery, reduced again to wood and paint. Only Maigret carried what it had once meant. He thought of Besson, now gone from here, relocated to another room, another silence. A man who had written words not to lure, but to release, who had thought listening a harmless kindness, a man who discovered too late that silence could be as binding as promises. He thought of Roland, who would return each night to a shop that smelled of paper and glue, where the bell above the door would ring for customers who wanted envelopes and ink, not conversation. A man who would remember, with bitterness or regret, the sound of his wife's voice when she had spoken too much and he had wanted quiet. And he thought of Jeanne, of the way she had hidden her ring not because she wished to discard it, but because she hoped to transform it into something else, even if only for an hour. Of how she had copied the words she could not own, resolve everything then, as though they were incantations strong enough to conjure a new life. Of how she had stood in the rain, believing the door before her might open not only to a room, but to an answer. The truth, as always, had been less than a crime and more than an accident. No murderer to name, no justice to pursue. Only a weak heart, a strong hope, and the quiet refusal of a man who could not be what she needed. And in the end, perhaps, that was the shape of most tragedies in Paris. Not a gunshot in the alley, but a letter too carefully written, an hour too faithfully kept. Back at home, Madame Maigret had prepared a stew, the kind that filled the rooms with a warmth deeper than taste. They ate together, quietly. Afterward, as he filled his pipe, she said without looking up, "You've been thinking of her again." He nodded. She waited beside the wrong door. And perhaps beside the wrong life, she added gently. He drew smoke into his lungs, let it out in a slow cloud that blurred the lamplight. "Perhaps," he said, but she waited all the same. They sat in silence, a silence that was not heavy but companioned. Outside, the rain began again, faint at first, then steady, pattering against the shutters in its old, familiar rhythm. It was the city's way of reminding him that there would always be more doors, more waiting, more stories that ended not with resolution, but with the quiet persistence of human longing. And Maigret, weary but steady, knew he would meet them as he always had, not with judgment, not with haste, but with the patience to listen until silence revealed what it must. He tamped his pipe, felt the warmth of the bowl against his palm, and let the rain carry the story away, drop by drop, into the folds of Paris. The city would forget, as it always did. But he would remember the woman who had waited beside the wrong door, 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 the wrong door. 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 The the wrong door.